This one is what the Bible has to say about slavery. So let's get into that one real quick.
They did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the response to the hypothetical crimes of the Israelites was to enslave them. And one of the things we should notice very early on in this is that the book of Exodus regards that move of enslavement as fundamentally wrong. It's like an axiomatic precondition of the narrative itself. And modern people, I suppose, don't find that surprising because we all believe that slavery is wrong. But it isn't obvious that most of the countries and nations that in the past practiced slavery regarded it as wrong. And so this invisible ethic that already permeates the narrative has a revolutionary aspect in that sense.
So, thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to tee off on what he said, which is exactly accurate. If you go back and go through all of ancient literature, go back and read Greeks and Romans and anybody who wrote, there is not a single sentence, there's not a single work of what you would call like abolitionist literature. No one is ever writing and saying slavery is wrong, ever. What you do get is people writing and saying, I don't like being a slave. But then what they do in those cultures is as soon as someone gets liberated, as soon as they get their own freedom or emancipation, then they go buy slaves themselves. So no one's ever in the ancient world arguing this is bad. They're just arguing, I don't like being on the bottom of the food chain. I want to move up. The first, I would argue this, vehemently, is that the first time you really see any anti-slavery literature is clearly the Bible. You have intimations of it here. Then people would say, yeah, but later on the Torah they codify it. Yeah, they codify it, but the slaves in the Torah have the right to get out. It's really more of a bonded servitude where periodically you have the right to be like, I'm ready to leave now. Totally different than what you would see in a Roman copper mine or, chained to the oars of a boat, or later in the American South. It's not the same at all. And then you get the New Testament later on, Paul talking about the slave's your brother, and, God loves a slave as much as he loves a rich person. And, you should treat them as such, and you shouldn't be threatening them because, God likes them as much as he likes you. So no one said anything like that before the church. And what the Bible does is, while, I have to be honest, it never says thou shalt not have a slave. What it does is it creates a set of rules that make it nigh unto impossible to have one, because it just simply doesn't work. And so, yeah, and the idea of basic human dignity, that we're all made in the image of God, and that if you're abusing a person, you're abusing the image of God. It originates with the Bible. There is no other ancient literature that speaks to that. And it does bother me when people attack Christianity and Christians on sort of human rights grounds, because I want to scream from the rafters, like, that's our invention. Like, we started that, like, that's not something that anyone, like, that is Christianity. Human rights are. They didn't exist before us. So
and we actually did a whole episode on that around Easter last year.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, about the Christian Revolution, and we kind of unpacked the three major things that essentially, Christian Revolution and Paul specifically, I think, unleashed.
And how us Christians stopped gladiatorial games and
all that, and
infanticide and crucifixion in the Roman Empire. Yeah, for sure.
That was really cool. Okay, so the next one we got. Let's just go to the next.
Also about slavery, but more of a personal perspective on it.
Okay.
The mystical fathers, they talk about Egypt also as representing your own passions. That is, you become a slave to something, and then you become an instrument of that thing, right? So it's like anything that you have, like you like to eat, and then you're there. And at first, when eating knows you, like when your passion knows you, then you're fine. It's in the right order. Things are in the right order. But when your passion or desires or whatever behavior you have forgets you, then you become an instrument of it. Right. Like think of a drug addict, where everything they do serves this tyrant. And so all their potential you get reduced to a potential for behavior, you know, and that can be
so
seen
that's for a
politically too.
subordinate deity in some sense, and that might be your stomach or your lust. And so that's very interesting too, because the word Israel means we who struggle with God. And so what that would mean psychologically is that that which should be at the highest place, which is the part of you that's struggling with the highest, is then subordinated instrumentally to something that should be lower in the ethical hierarchy. And that could be your own inner tyranny, and it could be someone else's instrumental will, or some state's instrumental will. And that's portrayed as fundamentally inappropriate in this text.
So this is kind of like slavery to self and sin. So they're kind of touching on that like tyranny without, tyranny within kind of concept. Yeah. I do think this is really interesting. An interesting concept. And I think maybe he even touches on this later, but Jordan always gets into like the psychological side of it. And he's like, what's happening? So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what I think is that this is more important. You know, I think if most of us are honest, and if the world's economic and governmental systems straighten themselves out, and America had, and Europe and all the world, you know, all the globe had.
If we get a utopia.
These beautiful, wonderful, benevolent governments that were doing right things. And yet, if all of that was true, probably 85 or 90% of your misery would still be intact. Because I just think if most people are honest, most of their problems come from their own lack of self-control. The problems that most people have in their lives, and I certainly can point the finger back at myself and say this: the vast majority of problems I have in my life while I get annoyed with taxes and bad governance and whatever, the reality is those aren't the sources of my problems. The sources of my problems are when I do things that are stupid. You know, things I probably knew I shouldn't have, when my weaknesses undo me. You know, that's just simply true. You know, and so I think it's fun and it's easy to get obsessed with an election or with, you know, some event, when really what we should be looking at is what's wrong with me. You know, and I believe wholeheartedly what he's talking about the hierarchy. Like, I do believe that we all have this sort of totem pole, you know, or list or whatever, and something's on top. And if God's on top, then your life does fall in order and things work. But if something else is at the top of that totem pole, you know, it could be a sin or a behavior like they're talking about, a drug addiction or something. It could even be like your job. It could be your kids or your wife. But if something else is on top, you know, what I heard, I think Tim Keller said this, like, you're going to sacrifice to your God. Whatever's in that one spot, you're going to sacrifice your family. Let's say if it's your job, you're going to sacrifice your family, your health, to your work and to making money, and that's going to mess up the rest of your life. So whatever is on top, and clearly if it's like an addiction, you know, if you're just kind of a lazy bum, you're addicted to video games, or if it's drug and alcohol or whatever, then you're going to sacrifice everything else to that thing and wreck your life. And we don't focus on that because that's hard. You know, we don't want to look in the mirror. It's much more fun to point at other people. And I think if more people would focus here, our world would get a lot better, you know, as opposed to just spending lots of energy on things that you can't affect anyway, you know. So actually this is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think they actually touch on this in another episode. I get confused because I've actually listened through like the first 5.
Yeah.
So I get a little bit lost. But they kind of talk about this idea, again, of like putting the internal things, like he kind of is saying, like, you make something that you should be subordinate to God. Mm-hmm. You're putting that something else in that place, and then you have that internal desire becomes the thing that you sacrifice to, essentially, because you're sacrificing, and Jordan talks about it a lot, but like you're sacrificing your future self to it, you know, in a way. So all life is essentially like you sacrifice something for something else.
Absolutely.
And that's, you're always sacrificing your future self if you're making the wrong choice, especially if you're making the wrong choice. And so it's interesting because they also talk about how when you make that choice, when you make the wrong choice, and we've talked about this before, actually, the consequences of a bad choice, you could say that is God's wrath, but it's really just in the real world. That just plays out by your choice.
You unleashed it.
It's not like God is unleashing wrath. That's just the way the world works. When you live in a way that's not in accordance with the way they would talk about it, transcendence, and the way we would talk about it is God's will, then you're gonna have wrath, and it's just the way the natural world works. Now you can say it's the natural world, but why would it be you know what I mean? It's obviously like an objective thing that just happens. So
thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.